The law said his customers' money was untouchable. He touched it anyway. In late October 2011, Diane Bruns logged into her brokerage account. She was a grain farmer from Iowa. She had spent years building a cushion of $200,000 in her MF Global account, money she used to hedge her crops against price swings, the way farmers have always had to protect themselves against markets they cannot control. The money was there on Monday. By Friday, the account was frozen. MF Global had filed for bankruptcy, and $1.6 billion in customer funds, funds the law requires brokerages to keep completely separate from their own money, had gone missing. If you have ever trusted a financial institution with money you cannot afford to lose, this story is about what happens when the person running that institution decides the rules do not apply to him. To understand what happened at MF Global, you need to understand who John Corzine was, and why his background made the disaster not just possible but, in retrospect, almost predictable. Corzine had spent 24 years at Goldman Sachs, rising to become co-chairman and co-CEO of the firm in 1994. He was, by any measure, one of the most successful bond traders in Wall Street history, a man who had built a career on reading fixed-income markets and making bets that paid off. When he was pushed out of Goldman in 1999 during an internal power struggle, he was worth approximately $400 million from his Goldman equity. He spent that wealth on politics. He spent $60 million of his own money to win a U.S. Senate seat from New Jersey in 2000. He served one term, then spent another $38 million to win the New Jersey governorship in 2005. He governed New Jersey for 4 years, until he lost his re-election campaign in 2009, partly due to an approval rating damaged by a serious car accident in which he had been traveling without a seatbelt at high speed in a state vehicle. He returned to Wall Street in 2010, joining MF Global as chairman and CEO. MF Global was an old firm. It traced its roots to a sugar trading business founded in England in 1783 and had grown over centuries into one of the largest futures brokerage firms in the world. Its core business was straightforward. It acted as a broker, allowing clients to trade futures contracts on commodities, currencies, and financial instruments. The clients, farmers, commodity traders, hedge funds, small investors, deposited funds in segregated accounts that the firm held on their behalf. These accounts were, by law and by industry regulation, completely separate from MF Global's own money. They could not be used for the firm's own trading. They could not be used to cover the firm's own losses. They were customer money, held in trust, untouchable. Corzine joined MF Global with a specific vision. He wanted to transform it from a pure brokerage into something more like the Goldman Sachs he had left, a firm that took principal risk, made its own trading bets, and generated the kind of returns that proprietary trading could deliver. This vision was not obviously wrong. Some brokerage firms had made this transition successfully, but it required capital, risk management expertise, and, most critically, the discipline to recognize when a bet was not working and exit before the losses became unmanageable. And here is what Corzine's entire career had never taught him. At Goldman Sachs, he had been one of many senior people, surrounded by risk managers, compliance officers, and colleagues who could push back on his positions. At MF Global, he was the CEO, the most experienced bond trader in the room by an enormous margin, and the culture he created around him was one in which his judgment on markets was treated as essentially beyond question. The discipline that institutional oversight provides was absent, and the bet he was about to make required exactly that discipline to survive. The trade that destroyed MF Global was, in Corzine's own assessment, a straightforward one. By 2010 and 2011, European sovereign debt, government bonds issued by countries like Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, was trading at significant discounts to their face value because of the market's fear that one or more of these countries might default on their obligations. The European debt crisis was real and serious. But Corzine believed, based on his deep experience in bond markets, that the European Union and the European Central Bank would ultimately backstop these countries, that political and institutional necessity would prevent any major Eurozone country from actually defaulting. If he was right, the bonds were extraordinarily cheap. A position in European sovereign debt could generate enormous returns when the crisis resolved and bond prices recovered to normal levels. He built a massive position. At MF Global's peak exposure, The firm held approximately $6.3 billion in European sovereign debt, primarily Italian and Spanish government bonds, funded through short-term repurchase agreements that required the position to be rolled over continuously. The size of this position was extraordinary relative to MF Global's capital base. The firm was essentially leveraged to an enormous degree on a single trade. If the bonds moved against it, if European sovereign spreads widened further rather than narrowing, the losses could be devastating. This is the same pattern we have seen in case after case on this channel. The moment a person with enormous personal authority and a distinguished track record decides that their judgment supersedes the institutional risk controls around them, that is the moment the fraud or the disaster becomes inevitable. Corzine's European debt trade was not initially illegal. It was reckless. And recklessness, in the context of a firm holding $1.6 billion in customer money that cannot legally be touched, becomes something else entirely when the losses arrive. The trade began to move against MF Global in the summer and fall of 2011 as the European debt crisis intensified rather than resolved. As the value of the European bond positions declined, MF Global faced margin calls, demands from its counterparties for additional cash to support the positions. The firm's own cash was insufficient to meet these calls. In the final days of October 2011, as MF Global's situation became desperate, and as the firm's management was simultaneously attempting to negotiate a sale of the company to a potential buyer, cash from customer segregated accounts began moving into MF Global's own accounts to cover the margin calls. Whether this movement of customer funds was authorized by Corzine directly, whether it was done with his knowledge, or whether it was carried out by subordinates acting on their interpretation of his directions, these questions became the central issue in the investigations that followed. The money moved. $1.6 billion of customer funds disappeared into the firm's own operations in the final days before the bankruptcy. And when MF Global filed for Chapter 11 on October 31, 2011, the customers whose money had been there on Monday discovered it was gone. Here is the question that the investigation never fully answered. Did John Corzine personally order the movement of customer funds? Or did he create a culture so desperate for cash in those final days that his subordinates did it without being told? The answer changes everything. Stay with me. October 24, 2011. MF Global disclosed its European sovereign debt exposure publicly for the first time in an earnings announcement. The market's reaction was immediate. The stock fell 48% in a single day. Credit rating agencies cut MF Global's debt to junk. Counterparties who had been rolling over the firm's repurchase agreements began declining to renew them. The financing that had sustained the European debt position was evaporating. MF Global's management spent the following week in simultaneous crisis mode, trying to find a buyer for the firm, trying to meet the mounting margin calls, and trying to manage a communication strategy that would prevent a complete collapse of confidence before a rescue could be arranged. Interactive Brokers emerged as a potential acquirer. Negotiations progressed. A deal seemed possible. Then Interactive Brokers' due diligence team discovered the shortfall in the customer segregated accounts. Hundreds of millions of dollars that should have been there were not. Interactive Brokers walked away. The deal collapsed. October 31, 2011. Halloween. MF Global filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The filing was the 8th largest in American history. 40,000 customer accounts were frozen. The customers, farmers, commodity traders, small investors, could not access their money. Some of them had positions in commodity markets that required active management. Without access to their accounts, they could not manage their risk. Some faced margin calls of their own and had no funds to meet them. The disruption to their financial lives was immediate, practical, and devastating. Diane Bruns, the Iowa grain farmer whose $200,000 was frozen, described the experience in congressional testimony. She had grain to sell. She had used her MF Global account for years to hedge the price she would receive. With the account frozen, she could not execute the hedges she needed. She had to take out a bank loan to maintain her farm's operations while waiting for her funds to be returned. The money she had trusted to a regulated brokerage, money that the law guaranteed was hers and could not be touched, was being sorted through by a bankruptcy trustee while her farm struggled. The investigation into where the customer funds had gone took months. The trustee appointed to wind down MF Global traced the movement of cash through the firm's accounts in the final days and determined that customer funds had been transferred into the firm's proprietary accounts to meet margin calls, the exact violation that segregation requirements exist to prevent. The specific moment of authorization, who gave the instruction, who approved the transfer, whether Corzine knew or directed it, was never definitively established in a way that allowed prosecutors to bring criminal charges. Corzine testified before Congress that he did not order the use of customer funds and did not know they had been used until after the bankruptcy filing. His subordinates gave more ambiguous testimony about what he had known and when. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the Department of Justice investigated for years. No criminal charges were ever filed against Corzine. The recovery process for MF Global's customers was long, complicated, and ultimately more successful than most people initially feared, though the path to recovery was itself a source of significant hardship for the people who lived through it. James Giddens, the trustee appointed to wind down MF Global's futures brokerage, spent years tracing and recovering the missing customer funds. By the end of the recovery process, commodity customers in the United States had received approximately 100 cents on the dollar, full recovery of their funds. Securities customers in foreign jurisdictions recovered less. The full recovery for domestic commodity customers was the product of an extraordinary effort by the trustee and was not guaranteed in the early months of the bankruptcy. For Diane Bruns and the thousands of farmers, commodity traders, and small investors who had held accounts at MF Global, the months between October 2011 and the eventual recovery of their funds were a period of genuine financial hardship. Some had to take out loans. Some could not execute hedging strategies that their businesses depended on. Some suffered losses in their commodity positions because they could not manage their accounts during the freeze. The eventual full recovery of principal did not compensate them for the costs they had incurred while waiting. John Corzine settled civil charges brought by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in 2017. He paid a $5 million fine and accepted a lifetime ban from serving as a principal supervisor at any CFTC-regulated firm. He did not admit wrongdoing. The settlement was the largest individual penalty the CFTC had ever imposed on a futures industry executive. It was also, for a man of Corzine's wealth, a consequence that fell well short of what many observers believed the situation warranted. By 2018, Corzine had launched a new hedge fund. He was managing money again, not the customer funds of farmers and commodity traders this time, but money from institutional investors who had decided that his track record, minus the MF Global chapter, was still worth investing with. The political connections, the Goldman pedigree, the Senate years, the governorship, all of it remained on his resume. The MF Global chapter was a significant one, but it had not ended his ability to operate in the financial world. The MF Global case is remembered today primarily for what it revealed about the limits of financial regulation when the person at the center of a crisis is sufficiently connected, sufficiently wealthy, and sufficiently able to construct a plausible narrative of confusion and ignorance around their own conduct. 40,000 customers had their money frozen. $1.5 billion moved illegally from accounts that the law guaranteed could not be touched. An investigation spanning multiple regulatory agencies and years of work produced a civil fine and a regulatory ban. It produced no criminal conviction. Diane Bruns got her $200,000 back. She got it back 14 months after it went missing. What she did not get back, and what no settlement could restore, was the certainty she had felt before October 2011 that the rules protecting her money actually meant what they said. Before we finish, I want you to think about this, not just comment. If you had been one of Corzine's subordinates in those final days, and your CEO was creating impossible pressure to find cash, would you have touched the customer accounts? Tell me honestly what you would have done. Corzine touched money that the law said was untouchable, and walked away. The next case we're covering, he didn't just touch the money. He invented the account it came from. Subscribe.